Well, good evening, folks. I'd like to welcome you all to the Iowa Socialist Collective's annual lecture series. For myself, I'm a student here at the university, and I'm also an AFSCME union steward. For your information, tomorrow's speaker will be Camille Colatosti. She'll be in the sunroom at 8 p.m. There's some literature over on the table on the right side of the room there that you're free to either look at or purchase if you're so inclined. Tonight's speaker is David Roediger. He's a professor of history at the University of Missouri. He's the author of Our Own Time, as well as many other works relating to the labor movement and labor history. Tonight's topic, he'll be lecturing tonight on the subject of From the Social Construction of Race to the Abolition of Whiteness. Well, I suggest we get to it. Thank you.
Of the students, how many are here because you're getting extra credit or you were made to come somehow? Yeah. Just what I'd like to know my audience and where we're starting from. I made John read that title, From the Social Construction of Race to the Abolition of Whiteness, because I didn't want you to hear it first from me. It's kind of a goofy title, kind of overly fancy. And what I'd like to start by doing is to allude to a quote from James Baldwin, the great American writer recently deceased, which maybe explains the title a little bit and gets us beyond the academic jargon that's in it and begins to give a sense of what I'm actually arguing. Baldwin said in an essay written in about 1982, quote, "As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you." And Baldwin was an African American, of course. He's addressing a white audience, so-called white audience. And he says, as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. And I read that in the mid-'80s, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. How could you not think you're white? What else are you going to think? It's only recently that I think we have the tools to begin to talk about abolishing the sense of whiteness among masses of Americans. That we can really imagine a world in which people don't think of themselves as white. And what I'm going to argue tonight is that as socialists, one of our prime tasks has to be to encourage that sense that whiteness is a foolish thing, a counterproductive thing, a destructive thing, an empty thing, something that's not worth having and not worth being. Now, the other fancy thing in the title is the social construction of race. And some of you will know that term a little bit from any of several courses. In the recent years, people in all different disciplines have begun to explain to us that race is not something that's made in DNA codes. It's not something that's a biological fact. It's not something that's real and scientific. It's not something that's natural. It's a category that people define themselves into and define other people into. And it changes over time. It's something that's struggled about. There's a good story about a white journalist who goes down and visits Haiti during the Duvalier dictatorship. And he notices a few white people in Haiti as he makes his way to interview Duvalier. And he gets there and he's curious and he says to Duvalier, "So how many whites live in Haiti?" And Duvalier says, "The island is 95% white." And the journalist does the double take. You've all seen pictures of Haiti on the news, and the boat people from Haiti recently. And you wouldn't say that they're 95% white, right? So the reporter does a double take and he says, "But how can that be? I look around me, I don't see any white people." And Duvalier says, "In your country, one drop of so-called black blood and you're black. In my country, I choose to make it 1 drop of white blood and you're white. And by that criteria, 95% of Haitians are white, he said. Well, race there is not something that's hard, fast, scientific, biological DNA type of phenomenon. It's something that people are arguing about and defining. And it's manifestly political, the way that we define who's black and who's white, what it means to be black and what it means to be white. And so for those of you who are in biology, you might have gotten this through Stephen Jay Gould or Donna Haraway's writings, in history through Alexander Saxton, Edmund Morgan, in sociology through Richard Williams, in literary studies, cultural studies through Toni Morrison or Hazel Carby, in women's studies through Bell Hooks, Vron Ware, in religious studies through Cornel West, in African American studies through Sterling Stuckey's great book, Slave Culture. If any of you have read any of these authors, R. Baldwin, or even my own book on whiteness, you'll know that people in a variety of ways are arguing that there's no such thing as black and white as a hard, fast biological category. It's always a social category. It always only has meaning as we think about it and as we struggle over it. And I think that when students come to this understanding that race is given meaning within human society rather than within DNA codes, they're often very excited because they begin to see that things that they took for granted as just the hard facts of life, the tragedy of existence, the stuff we have to live with, that those things are in fact made by history and made by people. And they can be unmade by history, and they can be unmade through struggle. And so that's a very exciting insight. And it's really only once we have that insight that we could begin to talk about the abolition of whiteness. The title of the talk doesn't make any sense unless you understand that the social construction of race means that race is no real thing, and therefore you really can look at a world in which there wouldn't be so-called white people. So the form of my talk is going to be to briefly defend this idea that race is socially constructed in the first section, and then move to an argument about what we should do with the fact that race is socially constructed and how that should make us think about American politics. I'm going to argue that we should keep talking about race, that race should be a prominent issue for socialists and radicals to raise, that people shouldn't just talk about class in the second section of the paper, of the talk. That'll be my argument. And then in the third section, I'm going to argue that specifically what we need to attack is not just the concept of race, but specifically the concept of whiteness. So in a very limited way, this is an anti-white talk. It's a very hard concept to get over. Any of you have read Stephen Biko or read Malcolm X or the new book by Amiri Baraka, people constantly get hung up on the problems of criticizing whiteness. Because if you start to criticize whiteness, it sounds like you're criticizing every white person. And you're singling out poor, helpless people who had no choice about what color they were born. What I'm trying to argue is that whiteness is a consciousness that people can try to work through and shed, and that therefore, properly speaking, it's not a horrible thing to be anti-white. It's a political position to be anti-white, and I'm going to take that, that position. Not being anti any of you as individuals, as individual white persons. So let's start with this idea of the social construction of race. And as I said, people get very excited when they get this. And often they get it in 3 or 4 different subjects, and then all of a sudden they understand what various classes are teaching them, or maybe what various books that they read on their own are teaching them, and they're thrilled. But then there comes a kind of sober awakening when you realize that as smart as you are, that doesn't necessarily get you out of the hard problems of race relations in America. Once you realize that race is socially constructed, you can't then just step over it and ignore it. There's a joke that some of the African American scholars are telling now that says, I've noticed, it's a bitter joke, I've noticed that all of my sophisticated work on race being only an ideology and a social construction doesn't help me to get a taxi cab to take me to Harlem late at night. See the point? I've noticed that even though I can prove on paper in a book that race is insubstantial and superficial and socially constructed and not a real biological thing, cab driver doesn't know that. And so I still have the same problems of any other person of color trying to get a cab in a big city late at night to take me where I want to go. So there's this excitement about realizing that race is socially constructed, and then there's also the problem of knowing what to do with that insight. And I want to try to talk about both of those things tonight. And in fleshing out this idea of social construction in the first third of the talk, I want to draw on a number of examples. Those of you looking at your watch, it's about a 50-minute talk, so don't fidget. I want to draw on a number of examples from around the places where my family and I have been traveling in the last 8 or 10 years to try to make this point that race is not what we think of it as being. It's not a hard and fast thing. It's nothing but the object of social struggle and the object of human action and thought. It's nothing but that. And if I only convince you of that, and if I don't convince you of my extravagant anti-white points in the second 2 parts of the talk, I'll be happy. If I just get you to think about the ways in which race is made, the ways in which our thoughts and our actions and our society's hierarchy and structure make us think about race, that's fine. And then I hope I pick off some converts in the second 2 sections of the talk as well. But let me begin with the kind of transatlantic tour of race with 3 or 4 examples, which Tony's already heard in a talk in St. Louis. 3 or 4 examples from Africa, from West Africa, from South Africa, and from Britain that I think make this point a little clearer. This last year, I lived most of the year in Ghana in West Africa, in the Ashanti region. And whenever whites go out on the street in Ghana, they're greeted by children who chant in Ashanti Twi, Obroni Koko Machi, Obroni Koko Machi. And English-speaking Asantis often translate this as red white man, good morning. It's the greeting. The kids can speak English mostly, but they're more comfortable speaking in Twi, and they sing to you, red white man, good morning. Similarly, Ghanaians use the term Obroni Wawu for used clothing that comes from the West and then is sold in Kumasi and Accra, in the big cities of Ghana. And Obroni Wawu translates wonderfully as the white men, they have died. In other words, we've got these clothes because the original owners died, and therefore we're ending up with this white European and American clothing. So it sounds like that we're seeing something like what we understand as race. You know, white and black. The world's divided into white and black. It sounds like people are understanding that in the same way that we're taught to understand race. But if you push it a little further, it gets messy. Obroni derives from the Akan word aburochere, which means from across the waters. And thus, it isn't the same as European and American usages of white. It's in some ways more like immigrant. The many Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese now in Ghana are generally also termed Obroni, from across the water. And Nigerians who come in across the land wouldn't be. But the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese are Obroni, are white men. In discussing the translation, though, Ashantis will point out that this is not just because the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese are from across the sea, but because they, quote, are white. That is, they're perceived as being just like Europeans and Americans who come into Ashanti society. Now, African American visitors to Ghana, and Ghana is generating a fair tourist trade to the slaving castles these days. African American visitors present an intriguing case because they're coming from across the waters, right? They're coming from the U.S. back to Africa, so they're crossing the water to get there. What are you going to call them? In most cases today, only the fairest of such visitors would be called Obroni. But in the recent past, there was a tendency to apply the term according to its original usage, so that black Americans would be white, or would be people from across the waters. Thus, it's intriguing in a number of ways that British listeners to Malcolm X's talks in Ghana, when Malcolm made his great celebrated pilgrimage to Mecca, he stopped off in Ghana and gave talks on the trip. And British listeners to his talks have on more than one occasion described to me that Ghanaians expressed surprise to them that an Obroni, Malcolm, could say such things. Indeed, one listener, British, recalls hearing Malcolm X described by a Ghanaian in English as a white man. And the quote runs, "How can a white man have such ideas?" Now, when we work ourselves around to the point that Malcolm X becomes a white man, we're dealing with some very slippery, socially constructed views of race. We're not dealing with a world in which there's a clear white and a clear black that just exist as timeless biological categories. I will admit that there was probably a little bit of playfulness in that Ghanaian's comment, calling Malcolm a white man. Other transatlantic experiences also demonstrate the social construction of race and the way it enters politics. In 1984, when we were living in the London borough of Brent in North London, immigrants and descendants of immigrants of many nationalities often called themselves blacks. If any of you were in England at that time, it's very common for the word black to be used in a distinctive way. And black came close to being what the British theorist from Sri Lanka, Sivanandan, has called a political color of the oppressed. In other words, oppressed people whom we would say are white, and whom we would say are Asian, and whom we would say are Middle Eastern, all started calling themselves black. And Siva's argument was that blackness had become a political color that the oppressed chose to identify themselves as. So that Asian Indians, Pakistanis, Malaysians, Turks, Chinese, Bangladeshis, Arabs, and even Cypriots and some Irish in Brent were defining themselves as black people. This drove the race relations experts in Britain nuts. They had just gotten their categories down, they had all their charts printed up and everything, and now at the bottom of society, people were just not using the terms in the same ways that they were supposed to be using them. One other example. In 1989, while on a movement-approved speaking tour in South Africa, my wife and I noted how consistently opponents of apartheid exposed the government-created mixed-race category of coloreds. People know what coloreds are in South Africa? It means people of mixed race. You know, in the U.S., the usage colored people referred to African Americans a long time ago. In South Africa, colored means a distinct category created by the government as a mixed race category. So one of the horrors of the recent past of South Africa was these racial classification centers would run combs through people's hair and say, you know, if the comb stops, you're an African. If you can kind of push it through, you're colored. And the colored caste, the colored race, was given petty privileges inside the racial hierarchy in South African society. Well, coloreds involved in the liberation movement in South Africa consistently exposed how hollow and silly this category was by taking care to use the term so-called coloreds whenever they made reference to that category. And in fact, many of the so-called colored population insisted that they were in fact Africans. They didn't want any part of this trumped up race that the South African government had created. Now, each of these examples, I think, is valuable in teaching us something about the way that race is thought up and the way that it's a product of various social situations, the way that it's not a product of a biologically determined product. But they're also useful in pushing our discussions toward how complex race is as a constructed idea, and also pushing our discussion in the direction of how this idea of the social construction of race might be applied politically. Once we know that race is socially constructed, then what? That's the hard question. What do we do then? And in fact, if you look at the Ghanaian, the South African, and the British examples a little further, each of them contains a little twist that makes us realize that complexity and makes us wrestle with the problem of how we develop a politics based on these new ideas about race. For instance, in the British case, we lived in London again last year, and largely this usage of black had disappeared, and people had gone back to referring to themselves by their specific ethnic heritage, Sri Lankans, Bengalis, Malaysians, Cypriots, Irish, etc. So just as the category of black expanded in 1984, it contracted between 1984 and 1992 and went back to older kind of usages. So how should political activists, knowing that race is a changeable ideological category, evaluate this change from a broad usage of black to a narrow? Was it the inevitable result of trying to build resistance based on the illusion of political color? Is ethnicity a more historic or even a more real identity? And is it bound to outlast the invented tradition of common blackness? Or, as Sivanandan argues, was there actually a possibility that people would have lastingly developed this idea of themselves as unified around the color, the political color of blackness? And was that promise betrayed by deliberate state policy in Britain and by opportunism among ethnic leaders? Similar problems with the South African example. As soon as I heard this usage, so-called colored, I thought, wow, this is just what I've been waiting for. This is exactly what I need in my own work. And so my own talks there were about how people why people think of themselves as white. Why is it that in South Africa and in the U.S. people have developed this, I think, counterproductive idea that they're white? Why is it? And so I immediately began to talk not only about so-called coloreds, but I pushed the usage one step further, and every time I said white, I'd say so-called white. I'm talking, and you know, if I were talking to an African audience and a white audience, I'd take care to talk about the whites as so-called whites. Well, that was a nice little piece of theater, and it helped me to make a certain point. But inside the freedom movement in South Africa, it was a stupid thing to do, because there are many people involved in the liberation movement in South Africa, often well-intentioned white participants in the freedom movement, who think that they can just talk their way around race. They can quit talking about race now that we're all Marxists, now that we're all involved in the liberation movement, we don't have to think about race anymore. So even though all the whites are at the top of the society and most of the blacks are at the bottom of society, the argument is that we have somehow transcended race. Don't have to speak about it. Well, by my saying so-called white, so-called black, so-called colored, it played into that kind of argument, that race is just this silly little thing that's only about words anyway, and so you don't really have to struggle against racism. I realized that, but only after several weeks of speaking, I was taken aside by people who were more perceptive than I, and I realized the mistake that I was making. Now, the twist on the Ghanaian example only appears to be more mundane. As we walk in Kumasi, I wrote this, the original version of this in Kumasi. As we walk around in Kumasi, the second biggest city in Ghana, especially in neighborhoods where we've not walked before, Africans sometimes cheerfully shout in English, "Hey, you are white." My kids and I'd be walking around, and that would be the yell. "Hey, you are white." Now, this struck me as being quite puzzling, as well as an example of one of those things where you don't quite know how to respond. I think it's a non sequitur, they call it, but I sure didn't know what to say when people said, "Hey, you're white." Only after several months did I realize that you almost never see whites walking more than a short distance in Ghana. And the full thought that was being expressed by that chant was, "Hey, you're white and you're out walking around." Or, "Hey, you're white and you ought to have a car." "Hey, you're white, what's wrong with you that you're doing this?" So that while the comment seemed to be purely about color or about race, and many of the people who were unhappy, the Europeans and Peace Corps volunteers who were unhappy in Ghana, this would drive them crazy when people would yell things like this at them and say, "Well, I don't go around making racial references to the Africans. What are they doing this to me for?" But actually the comment only appeared to be about race and about color, and it was about a behavior, that is walking around and not driving a car, which made color worth commenting on. Thus, while race is ideologically constructed, it's constructed from real, predictable, repeated patterns of behavior. And people don't just make it up completely out of their imagination. They watch things, they see things, and they begin to try to make sense of the world in terms of color as they observe real things that are going on. Whites aren't biologically programmed to have a car or a motorbike in Ghana, but in Ghana they almost never lack one of those. And this makes race seem to matter very much, especially in a country that's very hot, hilly, and dusty, and where walking is hard work. Now, for us to have announced to Ghanaians that what really predicts owning a car is income, ties to multinational corporations, missionary status, ties to the U.S. government, that wouldn't have made any headway at all. That wouldn't have been an explanation that worked. It seems like, and a good rule of thumb is, hey, the white people have cars. It works, and people will continue to think of the world that way as long as that's the way the world looks in Ghana. As Walter Rodney's magnificent History of Guyanese Working People observes, perceptions of the world in terms of race have thrived because they have quote, seemed reasonably consistent with aspects of people's life experiences. And that's where we get into a problem, because race then is both unreal, socially constructed, made up, imagined, and it has this kind of funny tie with reality at the same time, with what's really going on in everyday life at the same time. And given that, we can't just demystify race by going around telling people, hey, race is a stupid idea. Hey, race is just something that people invented 500 years ago. Hey, race is unreal. That doesn't work. If we're going to get beyond a world based on race, we have to be prepared to do serious struggle, serious analysis, and to think about what reinforces race and how we can begin to get beyond it. So that takes me to the second short section of the talk, which comes back from overseas and gets back to the United States. And in beginning to talk in this section about American realities, I want to organize my thoughts around why should we keep talking about race? I mean, look, once we say that race is socially constructed, why don't we just forget about it? Why don't we just say, hey, the real stuff is class? And, you know, some of us who are Marxists have been pretty prone to do that. To say, hey, the real stuff is class. Let's not talk about race any more than we have to. It's the dividers and the bosses that are always talking about race. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. But what I'm going to argue is that even those of us on the left, even those of us who are Marxists, we have to keep talking about race. And we shouldn't pretend that we can solve America's problems just by talking about class or by pretending that class doesn't have anything to do with race. The stateside evidence here in the U.S. that race is socially constructed and ideologically powerful and complex is quite familiar and chilling, but it's just as compelling as the overseas evidence. If we just take politics, for example, and I realize that the leaflet for my talk said I was going to talk about politics, and in this section I will talk about politics. If we just take politics for a minute, electorally, as Thomas and Mary Edsall's recent book has shown, in the U.S. for the last 20 years, maybe 25 years, we have been governed by a political color. What's made this system work at the level of national presidential politics is political color. Now, when Sivanandan talked about it in England, he meant the color of blackness and all the oppressed rallying to the banner of blackness. What's happened in the U.S. is the political color of whiteness has acted as a glue which binds together this new right coalition and enables the Republican right to pick up enough votes from middle-class, fearful, mostly suburban white voters to overwhelmingly win the White House time and time and time again. Since the completion of the mid-1960s civil rights revolution, only one Democrat has occupied the White House, and he, Jimmy Carter, after a particularly astute bow to the importance of ethnic purity in the campaign. Carter signaled, he was from Georgia, and he signaled that he knew the concerns of white voters. He was in favor of ethnic purity. And he squeaked by and won an election. But in the main, from Nixon's benign neglect, his promise to neglect civil rights, to Bush's Willie Horton, even the small, lukewarm Democratic commitment to civil rights that the party has had has left it so vulnerable to suspicions of being soft on race that it can't win elections. And the upshot of this has been that for the last 8 years, the Democratic Party has been engaged in a more or less open search, including rigging the days when primaries take place and the structure of the nomination process, to find a white candidate. A candidate who couldn't be tarred with being soft on civil rights. Now they got two of them. in this election. They didn't get one, they got two. Whiteness exercises such political force despite the fact that it's been almost thoroughly discredited as a cultural color. Now, if you think about it, it's a funny thing. At the very moment when you can rally people to vote for you on the theory that you have white interests at heart and that you're not going to sell out white interests, that's what Willie Horton was all about. At the very moment that that's occurring on a massive scale, culturally, nobody really wants to claim to be white. And I mean, from Martin Mull to every other stand-up comic, whiteness is the butt of jokes, culturally. White culture, white jumping ability, white everything is fair game for ridicule. And yet at the same time, whiteness is a very potent political force. At a time when so much that is new, stirring, excellent, and genuinely popular in music, fashion, oratory, dance, speech, sport, and now increasingly in literature, film, and nonfiction writing, when all of these things come from African American and Asian American and Hispanic American communities, there's not really much of a ground to stand on to defend white culture. And I'll talk a little bit more about white culture later. But white politics is tremendously powerful. So we face, in short, a mad and maddening situation in which the appeals of whiteness are at their most pitifully meager in U.S. history, and yet the effectiveness of appeals to whiteness, from Howard Beach to Simi Valley in the Rodney King case to the ballot boxes, are at a terrible height. The great American writer Ralph Ellison saw this coming over a decade ago, and he framed a question which goes to the heart of modern U.S. politics and culture with merciless precision, and this is one that you should really think about. Ellison wrote, "What, by the way, is one to make of a white youngster who, with transistor radio screaming a Stevie Wonder tune glued to his ear, shouts racial epithets at black youngsters trying to swim at a public beach, and this in the name of the ethnic sanctity of what has been declared a neighborhood or white turf?" What do you make of this kid? The symbols change, right? Now, what do you make of the kid with the Public Enemy ball cap and the Confederate flag belt buckle? You know, what do we make? Literally, what are we going to make of these kids? What are we going to try to tell them? How are we going to try to encourage them to change the world? Now, that question that Ellison frames there is one that I think that nobody in American politics, nobody in American society really has an answer for. We just don't know, and it's a very discouraging thing. And the same thing in England. The skinheads in England, the most racist white youth in England, grow out of a subculture based on black music. They grow right out of ska and two-tone subcultures. And then they become white supremacists. It's a scary, horrible situation, and we don't know quite how to deal with it. So we're unable to answer Ellison's question, and we're tired after a long period of Reaganism, racially based reactionary rule, and there's every temptation for us then to move from the insight that race is socially constructed to the conclusion that we should just quit talking about it, that we should get on to other issues, that race is the issue that the right wants to talk about, and therefore we shouldn't want to talk about it. And you see this all over the place now, and that from liberals on out to the far left, you see people arguing that we ought to quit talking about race. And the grounds on which they make this case are kind of interesting in the way that they shift. 10 years ago, William Junius Wilson from University of Chicago, the sociologist, was making the case that we should quit talking about race because race is not very important anyway anymore. He wrote a very celebrated book called The Declining Significance of Race. And he said, so therefore, let's turn to class issues which are really important, and let's not talk about race. Well, now there's a new generation of people who are arguing that we should not talk about race, but their argument is quite different. They're saying race is so important and so powerful that as long as we talk about it, as long as people are talking about race, there's no chance of us winning. Whites can't be won away from their racism unless we only talk about class. And therefore, because race is so powerful, we shouldn't talk about it. So you have the same conclusion growing out of absolutely opposite arguments. Let's ignore race because it's passé, it's over with, it doesn't really matter that much anymore. Or let's ignore race because it's too big a weight for us to carry. We can't win an argument which involves race. In policy terms, in political terms, the way that liberals generally make this argument, and I'm thinking particularly about the liberal journal American Prospect, which I think is becoming a sort of liberal think tank. The way that this argument is put is that the Democrats and the left have to frame issues capable of disarming race by involving the white middle class in economic campaigns, and especially in economic campaigns around jobs and around health care. So you quit talking about affirmative action, you quit talking about open housing, you quit talking about integrated schools, you start talking about jobs and health care. Such strategies fit closely with the dispirited mood of contemporary American liberalism, and they even have some, let's face it, they have some mass appeal among blacks. Blacks are voting overwhelmingly for Clinton currently. But what I want to argue here is that whatever their short-term appeal, that these strategies really stand very little chance of making any of the kinds of changes that we ought to be talking about during Socialist Week at Iowa State. For one thing, I think the prospects of success, even in terms of electoral success for these economic reform initiatives, are fairly small. The prospects for a mildly progressive class-based alliance are poor, first of all, because there's no labor vote of the size that there used to be. It used to be that 35% of the people in the United States belonged to trade unions. If you could convince liberal labor voters to vote for something, you could win. Now about 15% of Americans, 17% workers belong to trade unions. There's no strong base of a labor vote to begin these economic coalitions from. Secondly, Democrats can't really do much better about shutting up about racial justice than they already have done. I mean, think about the last few campaigns. It hasn't been a problem for the Democrats that they've gone everywhere and talked about racial justice. They haven't. So it's not going to be a tremendous benefit to them that they shut up about racial justice. Clinton's reticence in offering comment on the Los Angeles rebellions is, I think, standard operating procedure, with the exception of the Jackson campaigns, regarding race for the post-1972 Democratic presidential candidates. It's not a new departure. So in that sense, the strategy of ignoring race has already been tried, and it just hasn't worked very well. For that matter, I realize that there's a disjuncture between the extremely informal parts of this talk and the parts that I'm reading, but there are some things that I want to get right, and so I'm sticking a little bit to a text, and I hope you'll bear with me. For that matter, neither do the Republicans engage much in open discussion of race. You don't hear the Republicans talk about race either. They couch their appeals for a white vote in terms of welfare reform, so does Clinton. Look at his ads. Neighborhood schools, toughness on crime, and illegitimate births. In the 1991 Mississippi governor's race, the right-wing Republican winner, Kirk Fordyce, ended an anti-welfare campaign commercial with a still photograph of a black woman and her baby. He literally invited Mississippians to vote against African American people. The last image was literally a black woman holding her baby. And the thrust of the ad was, let's get rid of welfare in Mississippi. But he did so without saying a mumbling word about race. Race was never mentioned in the ad. In the wake of the LA Rebellion in '92, Bush's most vital soundbite ran. And here he's commenting on a rebellion in which 17,000 people were arrested, and his comment, which he packaged for the press that day, was, "For anyone who cares about our young people, it is painful that in 1960 the percentage of births to unwed mothers was 5%, and now it is 27%. That was his comment on the LA Rebellion. As the London